Jen Dyes here, and I have Abby Martin. Welcome, Abby.
Thank you so much for having me, Jen.
Well, we're so glad to have you. I wish under better circumstances. It's obviously indescribable what's happening right now in Gaza, Sheikh Jarrah. You and I were talking earlier that it's unbelievable the things that Israel is putting out there into the world to justify what they're doing. And if viewers aren't exactly sure of what we're talking about, we'll get into everything that's going on, sadly. But I really wanted to have you on because you are you've become an expert on this. You've gone to Gaza. You have an incredible documentary that you did with your partner, Mike, and Gaza Fights for Freedom, which I really want to dig into. And I think everybody should take time to watch. And I know that you've opened it up for everybody to watch freely, available on your Empire Files YouTube channel. I have to say, I've seen it, but I started to rewatch it a couple of days ago, and I actually had to stop because it was too heartbreaking at the point where the family this wasn't even that far in.
Yeah, right.
It gets heartbreaking right away. It was it was at the end of a lot of this that's going on there, the bombings and the news reports of the children dying, of Israel just indiscriminately killing these children. And so I was watching your documentary, and so it gets to the part where, and this is the part that goes unreported often, the everyday lives of these people. And so the part where I turned it off because, and this is a privilege, this is a very privileged thing that I did, and I completely understand that, where the family is describing that they, it was a family of, I think, 16 people, and finding food is extremely difficult. The things that the father was saying that they eat daily was basically nothing, spices and things like that. But describing getting water, water is life. And the descriptions of trying to get water and clean water. And you see the children trying to get the water and pump the water and things. And then I think it's your voiceover that says,
the vast majority of Gaza's water desalination plants, which produce fresh water, were destroyed or damaged by Israeli bombs and cannot operate. Fixing them requires importing materials banned by the blockade.
It's very important, obviously, for the reporting right now, where Gaza is in crisis and Palestinians are being bombarded and murdered. But also, this is all the time for them, where this is the diseases from unclean water and things like that. And so I think that your documentary does a great justice in that way. And it also, of course, shows the very dangerous aspects as well. And you were in danger for parts of this. So kind of talk about that. How did you come to, I don't know how you would describe it, but find a passion in reporting on Palestinians and decide to do this documentary?
Well, I'm glad that you brought it up, and I'm really happy you checked it out, Jen, because, a lot of Palestinians don't want to just be portrayed as just eternally suffering and being bombed and just defined by the death and loss. And that's why we tried to kind of juxtapose what's going on, the daily reality that they struggle with also their incredibly extraordinary heroism, and the love and passion that they have for life. One of the guys that we portray in the documentary, who is being banned from traveling because, of course, Israel controls everything, and so they actually have collectively punished all the people who were participating in the march and preventing them from going and get medical care in other places. And so a lot of these people have had amputations unnecessarily. And one of the gentlemen that we portray, he says, freedom is something in your heart. You can't define what it is. And I think that is something that Americans just really need to take a step back and really wrap your mind around, the fact that basic human mobility, the the freedom of movement and the freedom of being able to travel around is prohibited for 2.2 million people living in this besieged open air prison, denied not only the freedom of movement, but electricity. I mean, as the person that you're talking about, a gentleman who's now taking care of 2 families because his first wife died, he says electricity is as important as the air we breathe. And it's humiliating. I mean, to not be able to store food. You can't freeze goods or keep them cold because you can't actually have electricity for your refrigerator. I mean, it's just simple things like that that I just, we take for granted, of course, because we live in the US. But yeah, it's just horrifying. My passion, I think, started being surrounded by Palestinians when I first got into journalism, having to check in with their friends and family during the 2012 massacre that was going on, Operation Pillar of Defense, where 200 Palestinians were killed in the Gaza Strip. And I was at RT at the time, and I remember colleagues of mine becoming hysterical because they couldn't reach their grandparents or aunts or uncles in the Strip, and they didn't know if they were dead or alive because they just saw the flattening of neighborhoods, and it took them days to figure out, that their family was safe. And that was just really intense for me. And at the same time, I was reporting what was going on Breaking the Set, the show that I had. And that was the time that RT had a journalist in Gaza and in this tower called Al Sharok Journalist Tower. It's like a 13-story building that was just leveled to the ground a couple days ago. Yeah, so today you had Al Jazeera and Reuters and AP in this other giant high-rise building completely demolished by Israel. Ask yourself, what other government just demolishes entire high-rise infrastructure with just complete impunity in broad daylight, total unabashed war crimes? But this Al Sharok Journalist Tower was just leveled a couple days ago, but in 2012 it was shelled. And my colleague at RT had his leg blown off. My network asked the Israeli government, they said, why did you shell this journalist tower when you knew that there were journalists there? And the IDF spokesperson said, of course we knew there were journalists in the building. Everyone in this area was a Hamas target because they claim, this is what we were talking about earlier, they claim that all these buildings that they're destroying have like satellite towers or weapons caches inside. There's never any evidence to prove this. You would think that with this insane surveillance technology, Israel is one of the leading defense contractors in the world. They have their military technology and surveillance technology is actually caging children at the border here. So you would think that with this extraordinary surveillance technology, they'd be able to provide some sort of HD high resolution images to prove that there are these Hamas is using human shields, and that's why you can relentlessly bomb civilian neighborhoods. Of course, they have no proof of this. And even if it were true, which it is not, it's still a crime. It's still a war crime to target civilian infrastructure. So, but yeah, when RT had asked the Israeli government for a statement of why they did that, they said, not only did we know that there were journalists in the building, they said, your network has taken a side in the coverage, basically saying, we didn't like the side that you took, and that's why we targeted your journalists. Journalists are fair game if they're covering the conflict in the way that Israel doesn't like. This is just par for the course. I mean, during the Great March of Return in 2018, these snipers were mounted on hillsides behind sand dunes, literally with a wide view of the demonstrations while thousands of people were peacefully protesting and picking people off. And they actually directly targeted 2 journalists marked press and executed them. And they actually shot, I think, 35 other journalists. And of course, there's no accountability for these crimes. I just can't fathom. We hear all the time like Putin kills journalists. Well, we actually have documentation that Israel has sniped dead several journalists, and there's just no accountability whatsoever. So I think all of that put together really just sparked my complete horror and outrage, the fact that they could get away with this, the fact that it hit so close to home. And then I just never looked back, Jen, especially because, this is a so-called third rail issue in journalism. And I just felt like there was such a void and a lack of real accurate reporting on the situation. And, we understand how it works in the industry. There's certain things that you have to adhere to. You have to adhere to the orthodoxy of US capitalism and imperialism if you want to maintain power and maintain access. And we don't play that game.
in thinking about, that day that I was so emotionally spent from all of this and had to turn off the documentary for that moment. These Palestinians can't turn their life off for the moment. And there was a clip of a little girl going around from a Middle Eastern, I think it was Middle East Eye. Is that one of the networks?
That's an outlet, yeah.
Yeah. So it was a 10-year-old young girl, and I'm sure you've had many moments like this, but her neighbor's home had just been leveled, bombed, whatever, and all of the little children, her friends who lived next door to her, had been killed. And so this was today. She was interviewed today there, and she's 10 years old, and she's crying, and she's saying, "What am I supposed to do?
I'm always sick. I'm always, I don't know. I can't do anything. See all of this. What do you expect me to do? Fix it? I'm only 10. I can't even do anything this morning. I just want to be a doctor or anything to help my people. I can't. I'm just a kid. I don't even know what to do. Saying to myself, why do we deserve this? What did we do to this? My family said they just hate us. They just don't like us because we are Muslims. Why does Muslims act for you like that? We're just kids.
It's heartbreaking. And I wanted to ask you, that clip has gone kind of viral, and I've seen people starting to share things like that maybe wouldn't have shared things like that before. Do you think it might be different this time? Is there a different kind of feeling in the air with people who weren't aware of what has been happening? The Israel-Palestine conflict. I hate to call it that because it's really Israel destroying Palestinians. Do you think it's different this time? Obviously there's no answer, but
I think it is. I mean, I absolutely think it's different because I can feel it in my heart and my soul, and I see it with my own eyes. I think that we all do. I think that Israel had a really strong lockdown on the narrative for quite a while. I mean, we can look at just what Zionism is in general, and it's really a religious supremacist state that's based on the artificial majority of Jewish residents, which means that you need to continue the colonization, ethnic cleansing, and violent expulsion of the indigenous community. And that's been going on for 73 years. Today is actually the anniversary of the Nakba, which is the initial ethnic cleansing, the 800,000 that were purged to, basically eradicated from that area. 75% of people who live in Gaza are refugees, ethnically cleansed from their ancestral lands that are essentially right outside of this artificial border that's been imposed in them. I do think this is different because for decades, Israel's been able to maintain the agenda and deflect all criticism. They basically weaponized this notion that if you criticize a foreign government for committing war crimes, massacres, and atrocities, you're the racist, you're the bigot, right? And that's fascinating that has been able to work and has kind of multiplied out and proliferated to the point where people are just absolutely terrified to criticize Israel because it's become not only synonymous with Judaism, which is just so offensive if you are Jewish. Obviously all these anti-Zionist Jewish organizations worldwide that are condemning this and saying we are not associated with Zionism. This does not mean that you have to be a Zionist to be Jewish. But not only that, it's that the deflection of like what they do to Palestinians, they've somehow deflected it to what Palestinians are doing to them and created this kind of notion that they are the victim, right? They are the perpetual victim and they have the eternal right to self-defense. And I think American citizens in general have been kind of the last ones to wake up. Well, we're the last ones to wake up to a lot of stuff, right? The fact that our own government is committing a lot of genocide and backing a lot of genocide and atrocities around the world. But we grow up in this country thinking that like the US thinking that Israel is essentially just an extension of the US, which is really fascinating to me because I don't, it's so just abhorrent, right? And what it's doing is just so wrong on every level. But for some reason, we we are taught, and it's kind of hammered into our heads, that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. I don't know how you can call democracy a country that actually subjugates and denies basic democratic rights to 5 million residents. But that it's in danger, that it's constantly threatened by its neighbors, that if they somehow let Palestinians have rights, they would be killed in mass. When meanwhile, it's all this hypothetical scenario to essentially continue this open colonization project and this colonial settler colonial apartheid state. And for the longest time that worked. And I think that with the advent of social media, probably in the last 10 years, and I would say specifically with the 2014 war, things really started to shift because Palestinians were finally able to film themselves. It was no longer Israel putting out cartoons and doctored photoshopped graphics and, you know, IDF spokespeople all the time with American accents because they speak English directed toward American audiences all over corporate media. But the rise of YouTube and all of these outlets, and then of course Twitter and Facebook and all this stuff, people are finally being able to generate content that accurately depicts reality. And when you're getting bombed, you know, if you're a Palestinian, you are living in this rubble and you are experiencing these daily horrors, you film it. They have cell phones, you know, they're posting this material. And so for 2014, the horrific bloodletting that, you know, we saw 2,200 Palestinians die, 500 kids in a 3-week period. That was, I think, a breaking point for a lot of people. They were absolutely shocked at what Israel was doing. And then, you know, you had a couple of years later, the Great March of Return, which was another big breaking moment for people. You saw people like Natalie Portman actually coming out and rejecting awards that she was being given from the Israeli government. You saw a lot of musicians actually canceling their tours in Israel. You saw a lot of political pressure be mounted and a lot of academic and cultural pressure from the outside, from just important figures that were saying, I'm not going to go and speak in Israel because I don't share these values and stuff like that. And a lot of huge advocates for Israel actually flipped the script, like people like Seth Rogen, who in 2014 was saying this is Hamas's fault that 500 kids died. And then fast forward to today, he's saying, no, I don't stand with what Israel's doing. So now, after the Great March of Return, after the 2014 massacre, all of a sudden, I think that the sentiment and consciousness has been bubbling since those moments. And this is another huge moment where the consciousness is on fire. It's spreading in the most rapid way that I've ever seen. And Israel is so desperate. And they knew that this was coming. This is why they have kind of been proactive in criminalizing BDS activism, right? They've passed 30 or so laws across the United States to criminalize peaceful boycotts and constitutionally protected free speech. But this shift has been boiling under the surface for years and years and years, and we have not really seen it until now. And they did this knowing that they would be challenged in a big way soon. And they are scared this sentiment is going to develop into a real political movement that is going to defund them ultimately. And that's a beautiful thing, because I don't think that we can put the genie back in the bottle at this point. I think that, you know, you cannot call yourself a progressive if you are not for the liberation of Palestine. Right. And that's just not a tenable position. So as much as you have the liberal political establishment and corporate media running cover for this, I think that in political organizing spaces and anti-war mobilizations, this is an issue as clear as day at this point, and there's no going back. And that's why you see people like Benny Gantz, who's an Israeli cabinet official, going straight to Facebook and TikTok, urging them to censor Palestinian organizations and Palestinian journalists, and also quote unquote disinformation. So they're going to these outlets, telling them to censor, and they're doing it. TikTok actually removed one huge Palestinian organization's account, because this is all under the banner of fake news, right? Because they know how dangerous and damaging this is to their narrative. They don't want this stuff to get out there. And they know people are turning away from corporate media. So this is where we're at today, is that you have these social media networks and these tech giants acquiescing to Israel. We already know Facebook has several people working on the board that are actually formerly with the Israeli government or IDF. And, these people are littered across corporate media, but alternative media has become so strong, which is, of course, why they're now purging people's YouTube accounts. They've throttled Status Coup. They've throttled the movie that we put out. They know how dangerous this
even
kind of
Gaza
counter
Fights for
narrative is.
Freedom.
Absolutely.
Sorry
They
to interrupt,
banned
but
someone. They banned someone's Twitch account for 30 days for streaming it.
Yeah, it's absurd. I didn't mean to interrupt your flow there. If you want to keep going.
I mean, I'll just sum it up by saying the fact that you have organizations like Human Rights Watch that notoriously kind of both sides the issue, actually coming out and saying unequivocally Israel's an apartheid state and there's no turning back. You have the ICC, the International Criminal Court, saying, we're going to pursue war crime charges in the occupied territories. And then you have a Gallup poll that takes Democratic Party voters' opinions on the quote unquote conflict every year. And for the first time ever, more Democratic Party voters actually say that more pressure should be on Israel than Palestine. So even though you have unabashed Zionists like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and the rest of the people who are, claim to represent us, not condemning Israel and always beginning every statement with Israel has the right to defend itself against rockets without any context of what preceded the rockets, this is not going to be a tenable position anymore. And I think the pressure is just going to continue to mount as people continue to link all of these struggles together and understand how it all originates from the U.S. empire, from U.S. militarism, and that we are essentially subsidizing this terrorism and apartheid to the tune of $10 million every day. And it really has to start here, Jen.
I think it's kind of notable, speaking of the way that Israel presents things and the propaganda that comes out of Israel. This latest round of, let's call it terrorism from Israel, has started from what they consider to be real estate disputes, I guess, or what they would call like evictions from Sheikh Jarrah. And it's really striking. There are even videos of people that, Israelis that know the Palestinians' homes that they're going into, and they're like, I'm going to take your house. And she's like, no. And she names him. And he's like, well, if I don't take it, someone else is going to. She's like, no, you can't steal my house. He's like, no, I'm going to steal your house. It's obviously a paraphrase, but this is the reality. But Israel is putting out there that, no, that this is just a simple real estate dispute. It's crazy that the Palestinians started protesting over this, and they went wild, throwing their rocks crazy. And then they just started murdering the Palestinians. But from the point of view of Israel, or from the look of their insane Instagram accounts and Twitter accounts and their statements from Netanyahu and his cronies, they say the most absurd things. And we were talking earlier about these little cartoons. They have little illustrated cartoons that explain how everything is not their fault. Everything's fine. They're just the grossest. It's so stomach turning. And you have to think, how do people not see through this? But people truly, Zionists and people who've been kind of indoctrinated in this. I think probably some older people who grew up thinking that Zionism was the answer, and they maybe don't want to let go of that dream or whatever. But I have to wonder if, so today, as we mentioned earlier, they bombed the building that housed the AP and Al Jazeera and also residents, but they bombed this. They gave them an hour to get out, and you have to wonder if they're going to bomb the AP, and the AP is known for making headlines like this is an exaggeration.
Like impartial.
Palestinians ended up dead.
Oh, right. Yeah. The passive
Israelis were murdered. Like Palestinians murdered Israelis, but somehow Palestinians just ended up dead. So they're like an apologist for Israelis. But now that this has happened, maybe I'm too hopeful. Maybe the tides will turn. but they're still pushing out the most insane propaganda. When that happened today, I don't know what you thought, but my first thought was, there's no way that they can explain this away. There's no way that they can say, that Israel can say that this was justified, that bombing this building housing the Associated Press was justified. No, they found a way. They decided to say that Hamas was secretly in the shadows in the building, which is just bizarre. Of course, no evidence, as you said earlier. They never have evidence. They never provide evidence. As a great surveyor of everything, they should have evidence of everything that they say, but they just don't. So will that house of cards come crashing down if they're maybe getting too cocky and trying to pull one over on the Associated Press and trying to, kick them out of their ability to report? Like, will the tides turn? I don't know. What do you think?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that the reason that Human Rights Watch finally issued their giant report is because their bureau chief head was actually deported because he dared to actually talk about Israeli war crimes, even though he was equivocating them with, like, quote unquote war crimes in Gaza perpetrated by Hamas. So I think that when things like this happen, there is kind of a point that's broken for agencies, especially when journalists are affected on the ground. I mean, it is quizzical, though, because journalists have been targeted for so long, and Israel always has gotten away with the narrative that these people aren't actually journalists, they're Hamas agents. And I think it's important for people to understand that Hamas is the governing democratically elected body in the Gaza Strip. They're not a terrorist organization. They run the infrastructure, they run the transportation, they run the healthcare, and they do participate in armed self-defense, right? This is something that they see as legitimate resistance. This is actually something that's guaranteed under the Geneva Convention, that if you are an occupied people, you have the legitimate right to actually resist your colonizers by any means necessary, including using guns. So if you look at it in that way, it does become quite ridiculous that this narrative is constantly flipped on its head. And Gaza is such a densely populated area, 2.2 million people or so living in a strip of land that's 5 miles by 25 miles long. It's hard to imagine that you would hit anywhere that wouldn't be a civilian area. You know what I mean? So when they're bombing what they call Hamas tunnels and towers that house Hamas satellites and all this shit, they have no proof, first of all, ever. And then it's always like Hamas uses human shields, Hamas uses civilians, and so we just have to bomb orphanages and hospitals because Hamas is shooting a rocket in the next street over. It's like, what are you talking about? Why? First of all, that's a total war crime. Second of all, everywhere is a Hamas target, as we've already heard from the IDF, and everywhere is basically has civilians because it's so densely populated. It absolutely makes no sense any way you look at it. And it is just so crazy to think of how this all started, because I think a lot of people, when you sit Americans down and actually explain to them what is the quote unquote conflict, they would pretty much all agree on the right side of history. You know, we're trained that the most sacred thing is our democracy. So if you were to explain to people that 5 million people are deprived of actual basic fundamental rights, and 3 million people are living under brutal Israeli military law where they can't hold a flag, they can't pass out political literature, they can't protest, or they faced Israeli military jail, a lot of people would be shocked, right? That this is what Israel, the reality of Israel really is. Right. But Sheikh Jarrah is actually a neighborhood in East Jerusalem. We have the occupied West Bank, 3 million people living under Israeli military law. East Jerusalem is also under Israeli military law. And then there's Gaza, this besieged ghetto that is an open air prison that everything's controlled. And that's where Hamas is. But when you're looking at East Jerusalem, I mean, these were mobs of armed extremist settlers that tried to violently purge and expel Palestinians who have had roots in these homes, that have lived generations in these homes. And they all came together and decided the time is now to ethnically cleanse this neighborhood. And that's why you saw very harrowing video footage of armed settlers taking them by force, throwing people out of their homes, throwing their belongings on the street, lighting fires, shooting weapons. And that's that infamous video that you're talking about of a settler just saying, I'm going to take your home. And apparently he was squatting. He was already squatting in her yard for quite some time, which is why she knew him. And he just decided, okay, now I'm provided protection by the state. And actually to a certain extent, he isn't lying when he says it's not me, right? It's the state. They are completely protected by the state. You heard no condemnations from the Israeli government about what was going on because you hear the same kind of incitement from Israeli government officials. You saw Netanyahu saying, we're going to flatten Gaza. This is the first of many towers that we're taking down. I mean, these are open incitement to genocide and explicit endorsement for war crimes. And then you saw the storming of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. You saw hundreds of worshipers get sent to the hospital. You saw IDF tear gassing the hospital, war crime upon war crime. But all we hear, Jen, is rockets were fired and Israel has the right to self-defense. Well, what preceded the rockets?
Right. That's the thing. I cannot, no matter how many horrible things I've seen in this world, I cannot wrap my mind around people being okay with that. I can't, or not seeing that that's not right, or that that's not okay. I don't know.
They think it's like two states. I mean, that's the only thing that I can think of is that literally like the corporate media pretend, like you said, it's this passive voice, like Palestinians just up and died. We have no idea how they died. They just died in mass. Like, I don't know, did they die of a heart attack? Were they shot? Were they killed? Were they bombed? And the media always paints it as, first of all, it's very complicated. Don't worry about it. It's too complicated for you to understand. When really it's like the most straightforward issue. Right. And then second of all, it's like, well, Hamas is the ruling government. Like they have their own state where Hamas is the government and they're a terrorist state. And so they don't want Israel to exist and all of this. They never explain that actually everything in Gaza is controlled by Israel. Like they are deprived water, electricity, and mobility. Like, wow, that's pretty crazy, right? So all of that's left out, and people literally think like, oh, it's just two warring nations. They just fight all the time because it's all about religion. Oh, religion's so crazy. No, it's a settler colonial state that's committing horrific crimes and perpetrating apartheid. I mean, these are very racist, systemic policies that need to be abolished. And if you like explain that to people, I think they'd be like, oh my God, like, that's crazy. So yeah, it's like the media is just so carefully obfuscates it and dilutes the situation and just makes people, not want to even dig into it because they're like, well, I'll never understand it.
You mentioned apartheid, and I think that's interesting. Not too long before we started recording this, AOC and other squad members, I haven't checked to see if the chain's still going. It's one of those Twitter things where someone will say something and then another person quote tweets them. So AOC started it, and she said, this is not a direct quote, but she said, apartheid is not a democracy, something similar to that. And so using the word apartheid, I found, I raised my eyebrows. I feel like that is pretty striking for our government, for people in our government to use that word. And now Cori Bush, I saw Rashida Tlaib. So I don't know on that front how things will go. And we'll get to Biden. But what do you think about the squad and some of the speeches that came earlier this week on the floor with Congress members?
Of course, I've been disappointed with anyone who doesn't have, I think the bare minimum should be advocating for, of course, the rights of Palestinians and unequivocal condemnation for Israel because of just its sheer brutality and the unevenness of the power dynamic. But I will say, to your point about how are things changing on the ground, the fact that we have an actual sitting congresswoman who is a Palestinian.
Yes.
And you cannot deny her lived experience of being a Palestinian and experiencing the apartheid regime. And that is amazing, right? Like, that's incredible that she is a representative in Congress. Someone like Ilhan Omar, who was also violently expelled from her home in Somalia because of US policy and bombing. And she's a refugee and she wears hijab. And like, that's a huge thing. We've seen the absolute demonization campaign against her and Rashida. And then there's AOC, someone who has not been as straightforward as I would hope her to be, but she has stepped up in recent days, signed on to Betty McCollum's bill, someone who has tried to pass a bill trying to condition aid to Israel for quite some time. And then finally you saw squad members, including Ayanna Pressley, who was a Warren supporter, sign on to this. I mean, Ayanna Pressley actually voted to penalize BDS in the past. So I was pretty shocked and optimistic that I saw her, as well as a lot of the prominent squad members, signing on to Betty McCollum's bill to say we should condition aid to Israel based on human rights and international law.
Right.
Not too shocking of a concept, right? Like,
right. That should just be,
sounds pretty normal.
Makes sense. Yeah, that seems fine. Like a good
so
idea.
I was happy, because I think that and of course Bernie Sanders, but again, like even Bernie has to start the statement saying we condemn the rocket fire, and like it's just something that everyone says, although Bernie has of course been better than most. But I think anything that people are saying right now, bringing attention to this, is very good. Like it's just really important to draw attention to this, shine a light on it. And the fact that AOC has so many tens of millions of followers, and maybe a lot of just people who call themselves liberals, or maybe a lot of young Zionists, who like her, because they are liberal Zionists. And so that's why it's so important what she's doing, and to continue to talk about this. And I think Ilhan Omar did a big presentation where she was actually showing, bombed neighborhoods and bodies, and these are the things that need to happen. And so I'm encouraged by that, and I just hope that it will just continue to spread that fire of mass consciousness.
AFC also made another tweet, which kind of surprised me, because she has just, I have to say, disappointed me on other things lately, but she may be stepping up here a little bit here. She called out Biden.
Good for her.
Yeah, so I don't know how strong it was, but it's a start, I think. And so let's talk about Biden. Biden, as we know, is he's an Israel.
I'm just kidding.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Sorry, I just threw up a little bit in my mouth.
Okay, that's our statement.
Next question. Oh, just kidding.
He's said some really gross things. He's a huge supporter of Israel. And he's just, he gets money from Israel. And it's no surprise what he's doing. Maybe people thought, he's good old Amtrak Joe. He's going to have a heart. No, he still doesn't have a heart. He's still siding with his buddy Netanyahu and saying, Israel has a right to defend itself, which is the old thing that they all say. And Netanyahu a few hours ago said that they're going to continue until they accomplish whatever, and he thanked Biden. So
oh my God,
that was after
disgusting.
Biden had calls with the Palestinian president, as well as Netanyahu. So they're clearly, he's not standing up. He's not going to. There are no signs of him withholding aid from Israel at all. So,
Biden is certainly not going to take that approach unless he is forced to. I think that, and look at even what happened with the Yemen war. I mean, he's still selling weapons to the UAE, and that is still, the blockade is still continuing, this naval blockade that essentially is the main driver of the genocide in Yemen. And that was all a fucking front. I don't know why or how you can actually call yourself a human being, unless he's like an alien or something, like a robot. I don't understand how you can honestly, having children too. I know that you are a mother, Jen, and having a child and being a mom and seeing so much horror unleashed on the children. I mean, 50% of the population of Gaza is children, kids living under the age of 18. And Biden is just such a monster to me. The fact that 30 babies, little kids died, not just died. I'm being like AP now. They just died. They were murdered and bombed, and Biden couldn't even muster any sort of criticism of it all. Instead, he just said, I don't think that Israel overreacted. I don't think that this was an overreaction. It's like, really? 30 dead kids, Biden. you fucking monster.
Yeah.
So Biden is an unabashed Zionist. I mean, he's on camera years ago saying you don't have to be Jewish to be a Zionist. It's like, yeah, clearly, this is not about religion. This is about an ideology of racist supremacism. And Biden amazingly kind of sums up the entire purpose of Israel for the U.S. empire in another speech that he gave. I don't know if you saw this one. He had quite a bit more hair, so I'm not sure. Or maybe he got hair plugs. It almost looked like he had less hair back then, but he was younger. But he said in this talk, he said, this $3.8 billion aid package, he said, this is just such an important investment. He was like, because Israel is so useful to the US. He said, if Israel didn't exist, the US would have to create it, would have to create Israel in the Middle East to serve her interests. And so that really sums it up. I mean, this is such an important military proxy for the U.S. empire to serve as its battering ram in the region for whatever it wants to do to launch operations and all of this stuff. And so Biden, you know, he's clearly behind that. He is clearly unaffected by the massacre of babies and children. And it is abhorrent. It's abhorrent. And I mean, we already knew that he was basically like the most conservative, one of the most conservative, like quote unquote Democrats, you know, in politics. And so I guess,
come on, Abby, they say he's the most progressive since FDR.
Yeah, he's the second FDR. Who knew? Yeah, so I think that, you know, we cannot look at someone like Biden to enact change from the top down. It has to come from us, and it has to come from generating not only mass consciousness and sparking off the interest of Palestine, which is happening right now, and it's really incredible to see, but mobilizing together, standing in solidarities with our brothers and sisters, and forming an actual movement, mass movement rooted in anti-imperialism that contextualizes Palestine liberation as fundamental to taking down this out of control military industrial complex, because it all fits together. And until we kind of get to that place, I fear that Israel will continue to be able to commit these kinds of crimes with complete impunity, because, you know, $10 million a day to subsidize apartheid, that's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. And it has to come from us. But I will say that Israel is so terrified of this because they know it's coming. And that, I think, says a lot, because the fact that they've tried to criminalize what they know will inevitably bring them down is almost a win for the Palestine movement already, because you know, they know it's an inevitability.
يعني هذه بنتنا، ورزان بمثابة كانت بنتي الكبيرة أول فرحتي يعني. أول شابة مسعفة ميدانية متطوعة كانت هي أول شابة كشابة يعني كفتاة تنزل على المخيمات العودة، والكل شيء بادر فيها وشارك فيها. أنا كمان شاركت، كل البيت شارك، زوجي وأولادي وجيراني وإخواني، كل العالم يعني كل الفلسطينيين شاركوا. مش أكتر، هي صح رايحة وبعدين مسيرتنا مسيرة سلمية، ما احنا حاملين سلاح ولا إشي، بالعكس احنا بصدورنا العارية أمام قوة كبيرة من الجيش اللي هي مدرعاتهم وأسلحتهم وغازهم وطائراتهم. احنا مسيرتنا سلمية، بنطالب بحقنا، من حق يكون أنا إلي بلد، من حق يكون لي بيت، من حق المتشردين في البلاد في كل مكان هذول النازعين يجوا على بيوتهم. ما آن الأوان، ما كلهم قاعدين في العالم كله قاعدين وبتفرجوا علينا، كل واحد مرتاح. احنا عندنا حصار، لا معابر شغالة ولا دنيا، وين بدهم يروحوا؟
Well, I want to kind of, and unless you have anything you want to finish out with, I want to urge everyone again to watch Gaza Fights for Freedom, which, as we mentioned, YouTube has, I think you tweeted that it's been slapped with an 18 and up label or something like that.
It's crazier than that. It's crazier than that. So really quickly, it was suppressed in search results for the first 2 days, and then YouTube actually responded, and now miraculously you can find it. But beyond that, yeah, it was very nice of them to. I'm shocked that it's up, and it might not be for longer. So watch it while you can, and of course we'll mirror it if it gets taken down. But not only was an age restriction slapped on, this is something that is an unprecedented thing that I've actually never seen before. There are multiple modes of security measures that you have to go through to prove who you are, your identity. So I've heard this from hundreds of people all over the world, that they have to put their passport number, their driver's license, their credit card, their bank information to like actually prove that they are like a citizen. I mean, people are just like, what the hell is this? Like, people are actually saying, I don't want to do this.
Yeah,
understandably. So they don't want to like give up all this
personal,
data
to YouTube. Like, no one wants Google to have all that stuff.
Yeah. And I've gotten images of the share button is removed to a lot of people. It's not for me, but I don't know if it's maybe out of the country that the share button's gone. The people who subscribe to our channel weren't getting it in their subscriptions. And you actually, it's not getting recommended like it usually would if there's a video taking off and being seen and it's like a hot topic. It's usually in recommended, playlists and stuff like that. And of course, it's only happening through word of mouth. You have to go directly to the channel to access this, but it is getting throttled, and it's not surprising why, especially when you realize that these companies work on behalf of the US government and State Department to maintain and lock down the narrative. And that's what they've done. And for a long time, it's been increasingly it's gotten increasingly bad since the 2016 election. And I know that you guys have been on the receiving end of this as well, with quite a few videos that are just very, very timely and important coverage of what's been happening.
Yeah. It's, I think it's such an important documentary. I think everybody needs to watch it. I think it is a heartbreaking, heart-wrenching watch, because it makes us see the reality of what's happening. We can't just live in our own bubble and just be like, okay, our government gives Israel almost $4 billion a year, and I'm just going to ignore that. No, we can't ignore it, especially not now, especially no longer. Everybody needs to wake up. I really think everybody needs to watch Gaza Fights for Freedom. Go directly to Empire Files YouTube or wherever else it ends up having to be, if it no longer is able to be on YouTube eventually, and definitely watch it there. I don't know if you have any last words on this topic at all.
But yeah, I'll just say, go ahead.
I was just gonna hint at your CIA drops on Empire Files too that I'm excited about.
Oh yes, we have an anti-CIA project coming out where we're going to basically expose all of the craziest and most murderous stuff the CIA has ever done. So they've done a lot of wonky stuff too, but of course a lot of criminal, horrific things. So it's going to be a mixture. Fascinating untold stories called CIA stories that are coming out. So check that out. The first one is being dropped this month, but of course we put everything on hold to dig through the archives of our Palestine reporting to really try to wage this information war, because I think it's obviously very important. I mean, I haven't eaten in a week. We can't sleep, and I can't even, just like you said, which I think really struck me, Jen, is that you just said, we can turn this off, but they can't. This is their lived experience. And I keep thinking of that all day, every day. My friends in Gaza who are texting me saying they're trying to protect their families, sending me these photos and images. And it's just a lot. It's a lot to think about what they are going through. And if I feel this sick to my stomach, how are they feeling? How are they feeling not being able to leave, not being able to escape? And it's just unbelievably heartbreaking, Jen. And I want to encourage people to go to GazaFightsForFreedom.com because this is a film filmed by heroic Palestinian videographers and journalists who produced this on the ground. They dodged bullets. They risked their lives to get this footage so they could share with an American audience what is going on, how Israel targets them directly for peaceful protest. It doesn't matter if they resist peacefully or not. They are treated the same way. This video proves it. This should be a tool for the movement. Eventually, hopefully, it will be presented as evidence for war crimes in the ICC. Yes. That is our goal. But it really provides that essential context and analysis, that historical analysis that people need to really understand how this situation got to where it is today, and what the foundation of the state of Israel really is, you know, and how Gaza came to be what it is, what Hamas really is. It just kind of demystifies the entire situation in a really clear way. And I just can't recommend it enough, because there's never been a better time. And I know that we're all busy, right? We're all busy, but make some time for this, make some time for them, because it's up to us. It's up to us to spread this information to everyone we know.
Absolutely.
Everyone we know. And that's where the movement has to be, Jen. And I appreciate you guys so much. I can't endorse Status Coup enough. I love what you guys are doing. It's so different. You know, you look at the range of alternative media right now, and a lot of it's based on clicks and algorithms and what feeds the algorithm. And you guys are just doing something completely out of the box. And I love you for it, because it's so rare. And how sad is that real on the ground reporting is this rare. And thank you for your work, Jen. Thank you so much, and keep it up. And that's why I'm a member of Status Coup.
Yay. The feeling is of course absolutely mutual. You do fantastic and inspirational work, and Gaza Fights for Freedom, all the work you've done, like this, it's always had its moment, but like this is its moment. Like this is so important right now. So thank you so much for coming on. I know that everybody watching this is getting so much out of it and learning so much, and I know they're all gonna go watch Gaza Fights for Freedom right now. So thank you so much again, Abby.
Thanks so much, Jen.